Okay, friends, Josh Yeager here, fiduciary governance poobah. Continuing my walk with the dog Dodger, beautiful Santa Barbara, California, having conversations about fiduciary governance for successor trustees. I've already spent a little time on defining what the trustee's job is, where you find your job description, because without knowing what your job description is, you can't really know if you've done your job well. Talked about the compliance library and the office of the trustee, which is where you keep records that you have done the job that you have been given by the decedent initial trustee. And now we're going to spend a little bit of time thinking through what in fact are those duties. That these duties will apply to really everyone who is a trustee, whether it's a big trust or a small trust. Of course, the vigor and depth of inquiry that a trustee will do should be calibrated to the size and complexity of the trust. But what I'm going to go over now these are like the fundamental core foundational duties of every trustee, whether you've got grandma's house and a couple $100,000 in a checking account, or whether you've got a very large generation skipping trust with lots of residual beneficiaries and lots of assets within the trust, or a foundation, endowment, retirement plan. The process is the same. The level of vigor and inquiry per duty will be different. So simple trust might have one or two areas of inquiry, procedures that are done for each of these duties. Big complex trust will have entire staff employed to do this work. So first duty, let me back up a second. If you take all of the duties of a trustee, they can be broadly organized into the duties of loyalty and the duties of care. Duties of loyalty are what the trustee does as and to the beneficiaries of the trust, how they act to the beneficiaries. Duties of care are how the trustee does their job in managing and deploying trust assets, distributing, spending trust capital, etc. So broadly, this compliance library is organized by duties of loyalty and duties of care. Within those two sets, within the duties of care, there's a subset, which are the duties to monitor. These have become more important in the last, 35, 40 years, as individuals increasingly are named as successor trustees rather than large institutional trust companies that manage the assets themselves. This subset issue are the duties to monitor. This is where the individual trustee says, look, I'm not a professional investment advisor. I'm not a professional property management company. And yet I have a portfolio of stocks and bonds that I'm responsible for, and yet I have an apartment building that I'm responsible for. I'm going to delegate some of my duties as the trustee to a third party that has responsibility for doing them. But my responsibility doesn't end. I have a duty to monitor them. So that subset of monitoring functions is within the duties of prudence. Generally, a prudent trustee may delegate investment responsibility when they don't have the acumen or experience to do that work. And when they delegate, they have an ongoing duty to clearly or reasonably select the agent, to prudently delegate to the agent or clearly delegate, and monitor the agent's activity. Okay, those are all subset of prudence. So organizationally, if you've got, let's say, 12 duties of care, maybe 3 or 4 of them will be under the duties of loyalty. These mostly have to do with the duty to account to the beneficiary, to provide the annual account to them. This is not the tax return. This is something different that's called for in the statute, which is keep the beneficiary informed on what's in the trust and what you're doing with it, how much you got paid, these types of things. Really important duty right there, that duty to account, because by fulfilling that duty, by providing an account to the beneficiary, the trustee starts the clock on the statute of limitations that the beneficiary can sue the trustee for. This is defined by state. I'm in California. California, trustee can only be liable for injury to the beneficiary for breach of a duty of the trustee within 3 years of providing the account. So the Benny has 3 years to object to the account and say, hey, I don't think you did this right. But if the trustee has a disciplined process of providing the account, providing notices, providing the beneficiary the things that the trustee is supposed to do in their job description, then the beneficiary is cut off from suing for things that happened 10 years ago. So huge risk mitigation activity there. Probably 3 or 4 elements of the duty to account, which is a subset of the duty of loyalty. Of course, there are other elements of the duty of loyalty. Don't use trust assets for yourself, trustee. Treat the beneficiaries fairly, equitably. Don't act in your own interest. Act consistent with the trust instrument. A number of these. Again, the vigor that the compliance process will have relative to the duties of loyalty will be calibrated to the size and complexity of the trust, number of beneficiaries, risks accepted by the trustee, these types of things. Then we got another third, which are the duties of prudence. What would a reasonable trustee do under similar circumstances? These are things like establish a risk expectations and return objectives, make sure that there's adequate liquidity within the trust to fulfill the trust purposes, manage the trust consistent to the trust purposes, typically the health, welfare, maintenance, and support of grandma. So that implies some sort of reasonable distribution rate, so some work has to be done on, well, how much of this trust am I going to distribute to grandma each year, or to the nieces and nephews each year. Duty to diversify the trust assets. Subset issues of, geez, if I've got half of the trust assets in an apartment building in Long Beach, do I have to sell it and diversify it? Don't worry, we'll come back to each of these. These are just a recitation of what the duties of care are for a trustee. Trustee has a duty to pay only fair fees. 2 subset issues there. 1, the fees paid to the investment advisor, property manager, delegatee, let's call them. And the other are the fees that the trustee paid to themselves for occupying the office and taking on all this headache for nieces and nephews or children from the first marriage. Then we've got, that kind of goes through, let's see, duty to diversify, duty to pay fair fees. Then we've got the duty to prudently select agents when a trustee decides to delegate. When a trustee says, look, it's beyond my scope or experience to manage this $2.5 million portfolio of marketable securities, I'm going to hire someone to do that. I'm going to hire the guys at Wells Fargo. Okay, so the trustee needs to prudently select the team that they're being used. You can't just say, well, Grandpa used them, so I'm going to use them. Or they always return my phone calls. These are not a reasonable basis for selecting the agent. So got to go through a process of defining why we chose who we chose, when we chose them. Once we've chosen that agent, then we have to prudently delegate to the agent. What are my expectations of you, agent? What fee did we agree to pay? What kind of risk did we agree to accept? What kind of conflicts of interest, if any, am I willing to accept in this relationship? What capacity do you serve me, the trustee, or do you act as a fiduciary to me? Or do you act with some lesser responsibility to me? So there's the delegation, time horizon, distribution rate. These types of things are communicated to the property manager, manager of the Kentucky Fried Chicken franchise that is owned by the trust, manager of the apartment building in Long Beach. And then last is the monitoring component. How do we know that the delegatee has done the things that they have said they do? Well, we wrote a job description in our delegation. That's kind of like the equivalent of an investment policy statement. Might be another term for that. And have some annual review process. So, big picture, all the duties of care of any trustee, be they the trustees of the largest trust in the United States, the California Teachers Retirement Plan with $400 billion of assets, or eldest daughter who's taking care of grandma's trust. Same duties of care, duties of loyalty and duties of care. Within duties of loyalty, duty to account, and some other perfunctory duties that should also be addressed in the compliance library. That's about a third of the total memos that go in the library. Another third are the duties of prudence, why the trustee did what they did when they did it, as to risk, return, distribution rate, concentration of assets, fees that the trustee paid. And then the last third has to do with when the trustee has delegated investment or management responsibility to a third party, that they have done that component right. Again, a subset of the duties of prudence. Okay, so that's kind of the overview of what goes into the compliance library and what the duties of care are. Future conversations will be had on each of those duties, tips and tricks, interesting court cases, conundrums that we've faced with our clients when helping them do this stuff. So long. Till next time. Ciao.